Hello, and thank you for choosing to watch this short lecture on de-escalation strategies and post-crisis intervention. This PowerPoint was developed by Orly Maya and Kayla Donovan, who are currently occupational therapy doctorate students at Rush University. And this presentation was developed in hopes for it to be used as an educational resource for individuals who are foster parents within the foster care system. So here is a little table of contents for what we will be talking about today. The first thing we'll talk about is what's happening in the brain during a crisis. What does it mean to be trauma informed? How to use your use of self and intentional language during a crisis, active listening, as well as post-crisis intervention. So, what is happening in the brain during a crisis? So, when you're faced with something stressful or a potentially dangerous situation, the brain triggers a stress response, otherwise known as you might have heard of the fight or flight response, or fight, flight, or freeze. So this is a natural increase in stress that can sometimes interrupt people's ability to think clearly, respond appropriately. You're put into this state of panic where you have to choose how to respond quickly without really thinking. So during this type of stress response, there's really three parts of the brain that are working together. And that's your thinking brain, your emotional brain, and your survival brain. So let's dive deeper into what these three parts really do. So your thinking brain kind of controls your logic and your critical thinking. So how to really go about the situation in the most effective way possible. That's what your thinking brain really works towards. Your emotional brain is controlling your emotions, your feelings. So what's going through your mind in terms of how you're feeling about this situation. And your survival brain controls your bodily functions in terms of survival. So, what's your heart rate doing? How's your breathing? Things like that. And it's important to realize that children or any individual who have been experiencing difficult situations since they were a young age, they've had less opportunity to really develop and regulate these stress responses. So sometimes individuals who have had and been through hard times as a child, they're not really able to regulate their stress responses as well as someone who has not been through those things. And really what happens there is their survival brain and their emotional brain can overtake their thinking brain, which results in an elevated state and could potentially become a crisis situation. So what does it mean to be trauma informed? So being trauma informed, it's important to be trauma informed when you're working with kids or any individual who might have experienced hardships. And being trauma informed means that you recognize the way that their trauma has affected this individual. How has it affected their ability to regulate their emotions? How has it affected, their ability to really think through situations where they might feel like they're in a dangerous situation. And so to be trauma informed, you really have to, understand the individual that you're working with in an effort to not re-traumatize them. So you have to understand, well, what was their past like? What kind of things have they had to deal with before? What triggers them? How can I help this person in a way that's not making things harder for them? And a way that you can really do that is through use of self. So how can you use your body language and the way that you respond verbally to influence how another person feels? So then that brings us into the use of self and use of intentional language. So what is use of self? Like I said, it's kind of knowing how to use your own skills and characteristics to influence a situation. So for example, how can you use your body language to affect how another person is feeling. Maybe that means getting down to their level, kind of looking them in their face, or making sure your shoulders are facing them so that they feel like you are part of the conversation and care to listen to them. Also, making eye contact. That's just a really easy way to show that person that you care. Using a tone of voice, when you're speaking with someone who may be having an emotional crisis, using a lower tone of voice, speaking slowly, these things can help the person feel at ease. Also, how you respond. So what words are you using to kind of influence the situation, and how can the things you say help a person to feel better when they're in a crisis? So, the things that you say hold a lot of meaning, especially when someone is in such an elevated state where they're not able to think clearly. So you really have to kind of meet the person where they're at in order to kind of help them through what they're going through. So there's different ways that you can kind of change what you're talking about and how you respond to meet their needs. So sometimes someone really wants you to kind of collaborate with them. They want you to help think of ways to kind of solve the situation. Sometimes people really just need encouraging words to kind of help them get through what they're going through, and help have you show them that you believe that they're capable. Another one is problem solving. How can you, as the person helping them, help them think through the issue that they're having to come up with new ideas. And also sometimes people just need your empathy. Sometimes people just need you to listen and to show that you understand what they're going through. And that can really do the trick. All right, next we're talking about active listening, which is another way that you can kind of use your own skills to help someone through a crisis situation. So active listening is a way of listening and responding to another individual that allows for a more meaningful exchange. It allows the person to feel heard, and it creates a space for them to be able to share their emotions without feeling judgment or like they are unsafe. So some of the key components of active listening are making sure to have that eye contact. I kind of mentioned that earlier, but eye contact is a really easy way for you to make that connection with someone and show them that you are present in the conversation. Also, asking open-ended questions. So an open-ended question is a question that the person would have to share more information rather than just saying yes or no. So an example of an open-ended question is, well, how did that make you feel? Or can you elaborate a little bit more on what happened? So it gives the person an opportunity to really dive deep and share what they're thinking rather than just answering it with a yes or a no. And lastly, during active listening, you really want to make sure that you're withholding judgment and advice, because this is your chance to show the person that you're talking to that you are here with open ears and you are purely just listening to what they have to say. Because sometimes when you throw in advice, it makes people feel like you're not really hearing them, and you're kind of listening to respond rather listening to understand. All right, and lastly, we're going to talk about post-crisis intervention. So what can you do after this individual kind of has an episode where they've been in severe emotional distress? So after someone experiences an emotional crisis, it can be difficult to approach them about what happened, because they're in a really elevated emotional state. You don't want to re-trigger them. You want to make sure you're being trauma informed. So a really good tool is something called a life space interview. It's a really great way of opening up the conversation to allow a child to share their thoughts and feelings, and while also kind of having an effective conversation with them about those feelings. So you can kind of dive deep into what happened, why did it happen, and how to move forward afterwards. So There are specific steps to having a life space interview with an individual. The first step that's honestly probably the most important is identifying a time and a place that you will have this conversation. So you want to make sure that it's the conversation happens in an environment that is different to where the emotional crisis happens. You want somewhere neutral where this person can feel safe and able to tap into these difficult emotions that they were feeling previously. The next step is to kind of explore the child's point of view. So from their perspective, what happened? And this is a really great time to use your active listening skill of withholding judgment, because you really want this child to share everything that they went through, and really let it all out so that you could also understand in depth, what they went through, but also having them work through their ideas a little bit more. Next is you want to summarize those thoughts and feelings. So this is where you kind of go over what the child said to make sure that everything is clear and you're in full understanding of their thoughts and their feelings. This will really help them feel heard in this type of situation, and just to make sure that there's no misunderstandings and that with everything moving forward, you're able to fully understand where they're coming from. The next step is to make sure to connect the trigger to their feelings, to their behavior. This step is really important in allowing the child to kind of understand the consequences of their actions and of their own feelings. So really making that connection and verbally saying, so this is what happened, this is how it made you feel, and this is how you responded to it. It kind of putting it in plain terms like that can help the child, understand where they could have gone differently, and what they could have done to kind of make the situation feel better and more safe instead of reaching that crisis state. The next step is to create an alternative response to their feelings. So this is where you're kind of leading a discussion and coming up with different ways they could have gone about the situation. So it would have been more safe and more effective. Maybe designating an example could be designating someone that child would go to specifically when they're feeling a certain way, or different strategies they could use if they start to feel themselves, becoming emotional in a way that could lead to a crisis. It could be getting a drink of water, or leaving the room, or, listening to calming music. These are all ways that they could have, maybe prevented themselves from reaching that final stage of crisis. The second to last step of the life space interview is to, kind of practice those alternative responses that you had previously discussed. So this would be a great time to do a little bit of role play. You can say, all right, let's pretend like we're that situation is happening again, and you can kind of practice, those alternative responses that we came up with together. And that kind of allows the child to see how those responses would play out in a real situation. And it helps them to feel a little bit better about, calling upon those strategies. And lastly, you want to enter the child back into their routine. So after a crisis situation, you really want to kind of get them back into doing what they were doing previously, so they don't feel like there was too much of a disruption in their day. They had a crisis, which is totally fine. They were able to talk it through, but now it's just time to move on and try to be better in the future after having discussed what to do instead. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope these tips and tricks can help you the next time that you're dealing with a difficult situation with a child. And just remember that every child is different, and you might need to kind of call upon different strategies with different children. So again, thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.